Has India's economy recovered fully from the pandemic? That's the question I want to ask in this video. And with that, let's go to our first chart. I have plotted real deseasonalized Indian GDP in blue. That is, I've taken out the seasonal fluctuations in GDP because of harvests, etc. And I've also corrected for inflation. The source data are from the Central Statistical Organization of the government. I've also plotted a trend line which grows at about 6% from the beginning of 2016. That's the orange line. And I picked the starting point to reflect when India had recovered fully from the global financial crisis. We can pick another starting point, but the overall message will not change. Now, why do I pick that line to grow at 6%? It's approximately the pace we have grown at for the last 30 years. That is, it's a measure of our capacity to grow, provided we have reasonable governance. Economists call this the growth potential of an economy. And so let's take 6% as the growth potential for India right now. So what's the bottom line of this graph? It basically says that despite strong recent growth, India's GDP is still way below the 6% trend line of our potential. In other words, we have this gap which has built up between our growth, actual growth, and the potential growth. Now, what we need to do is understand how this came about. Look at this chart closely. You will see the first dip in growth came in the fourth quarter of 2016. That's around here, probably because of demonetization. But GDP then fell sharply in around 2019 and fell below the trend line. That's this movement here when it goes below the trend line. But of course, the most horrendous quarter in Indian GDP growth came in the second quarter in the calendar year of 2020, which is when we had the total lockdown as a result of the pandemic. Well, GDP climbed back up, but in the second quarter of 2021, we had the second wave of COVID, which took us down again significantly. After that, we came back to grow at around 6%, but if anything, we've diverged a little more from that trend growth line. Of course, the single biggest factor in this has been the pandemic. We really need to understand how much of it was due to misgovernance and how much due to factors beyond the government's control. And for that, we need a proper inquiry into the pandemic response. That will enable us to learn lessons for the future, but that is not on the cards. What about the recent spectacular GDP growth numbers with 8.4% growth last quarter? Unfortunately, these numbers are somewhat misleading. I will explain why in the next video. The bottom line, however, is that we're still growing only around potential, about 6%. So we've not made up the growth deficit that we incurred over the pandemic, and so we're still below the yellow line, unlike countries like the United States. The consequences of the growth deficit extend beyond mere numbers. They're manifested, as I'll argue in future videos, in higher unemployment and sluggish consumption, for the most part amongst India's middle and lower middle classes. But perhaps another comparison will bring home our growth deficit. Despite the strong recent growth numbers, India's cumulative GDP growth rate since 2019 is only 4.2%. We like to compare ourselves with China, which has serious growth problems today. Yet cumulatively, Chinese growth is higher at 4.6% every year, even though it's a much richer and larger economy. That should be sobering for all of us. I will explain in the next video why the recent GDP numbers are good, but not as spectacular as they seem at first.